They call it Europe's darkest secret, a fortress tucked behind concrete walls on the outskirts of Tbilisi, a place where the outside world only hears whispers, a place where fear doesn't hide in the shadows. It runs the entire system. This is Gldani prison, also known as prison number 8, the most notorious correctional facility in Georgia. What you're about to see isn't fiction. It isn't exaggerated. For years, human rights groups described it as a pressure cooker of power, intimidation, and institutional collapse. And when the truth finally surfaced, it shook an entire nation. But to understand how this prison became infamous, how it turned into a symbol of brutality and corruption, we must step inside its walls, trace the origins of its secrets, and uncover the stories of the inmates who lived through it. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're re-watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. But here's the chilling part. Even after reforms, even after global outrage, and even after government investigations, former inmates still describe Gldani as a place where survival depends on alliances, silence, and luck. And in today's documentary, we follow the real events that expose this prison, the political storm that followed, and the personal accounts of men who entered Gldani believing they would serve their time, but left as completely different people. Some left stronger, some left traumatized, and some never left at all. This is the untold story of Gldani prison, the true heartbeat of Georgia's most brutal prison system. To understand Gldani, you must first understand Georgia's turbulent history. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the country struggled to stabilize, crime rose, corruption spread, and prisons became overcrowded battlegrounds for power. By the mid-2000s, Georgia carried one of the highest incarceration rates in Europe. Gldani wasn't built to be a nightmare. It was built to be a modern correctional center, a place meant to represent Georgia's efforts to reform. But the reality inside its walls was far more complicated. Human rights organizations started receiving letters, dozens, then hundreds, from inmates describing harsh conditions, lack of medical care, and a system where authority was not exercised through rules, but through force. Yet none of these warnings gained momentum, until one event changed everything. Footage leaked. Raw, undeniable footage taken from inside Gldani. And overnight, the entire country erupted. The footage exposed what many prisoners had claimed for years, but now it was recorded, visible, impossible to ignore. Gldani became the symbol of a nationwide conversation about power, punishment, and human rights. But to understand the depth of the problem, we must go back to the beginning. Gldani prison isn't just a building, it's a design. A design that shapes behavior, controls movement, and isolates people physically and psychologically. The facility is divided into multiple blocks, each holding a different category of inmate: petty offenders, organized crime affiliates, political detainees, high-risk prisoners, and those awaiting trial. Each wing was built with narrow hallways, reinforced gates, and limited visibility, a layout that allowed complete surveillance but offered inmates almost no privacy. In theory, this controlled chaos. In practice, it created an environment where pressure never eased. Former staff members described working long shifts with limited resources. Officers were often outnumbered. Inmates formed alliances. Power flowed through informal networks rather than official channels. But the true nature of Gldani wasn't in the layout. It was in the stories. One of the earliest recorded complaints came from a man we'll call Levin. His story reflects many others who tried to speak out. Levin was a young man, arrested for a non-violent offense. He expected prison to be tough, but he didn't expect the atmosphere inside Gldani, a constant tension, like the building itself was holding its breath. He described nights where inmates whispered through vents, exchanging warnings about upcoming searches or internal disputes. But what stood out most was the culture of silence. Levin attempted to file an official complaint, a simple request for a medical inspection. He said the moment he submitted the document, everything changed. His cell was suddenly moved. Routine checks became more aggressive, and unknown inmates began questioning him. To Levin, it was a message: some things stay inside these walls. His letters reached human rights groups, but progress was slow. Gldani also held another category of inmates, those arrested in politically sensitive cases. In Georgia's shifting political climate, opposition members and activists sometimes found themselves detained under charges they claimed were exaggerated. These detainees often had outside support and lawyers, but even they described the same environment: a system where the rulebook didn't always match the reality. One former political detainee said Gldani was less about physical force and more about psychological pressure, isolation, unpredictable routines, and the feeling that speaking out could only make things worse. Like many post-Soviet prisons, Gldani had an internal hierarchy influenced by the thieves-in-law culture, an organized criminal tradition with its own rules and ranks. But in Gldani, this hierarchy clashed with prison administration. Both sides monitored each other. Both tried to maintain influence. And inmates caught in the middle often paid the price. Some prisoners aligned with groups for protection. Others stayed independent, navigating daily life carefully, avoiding conflicts, avoiding favors, avoiding attention. Former inmates say the unwritten rule was simple: don't owe anyone. Not an item. Not a gesture. Not even information. Because in Gldani, debts weren't forgotten. The turning point in Gldani's history came from inside, not from a prisoner, but from someone who worked there. A staff member who witnessed enough to know that silence was no longer an option. We'll call him Nico. He wasn't a high-ranking official or a political figure. He was a mid-level employee who watched things unfold every day and realized the truth would never come out unless someone took a risk. What Nico did next would ignite protests across Georgia, bring down officials, and leave Gldani forever associated with one of the biggest prison scandals in modern European history. But to understand his decision and the consequences, we need to follow his story step by step. For years, Nico showed up to work like everyone else, quietly, professionally, and without drawing attention. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't perfect. But he was observant, and he saw what many tried to ignore. He noticed how some inmates were handled differently, how certain requests would mysteriously disappear, and how internal reports rarely matched what actually happened inside the blocks. What truly pushed him over the edge was watching new guards arrive full of optimism, only to change within months. The environment seemed to reshape people, teaching them one lesson above all: it's easier to stay silent. Nico stopped sleeping well. He became anxious, distrustful. He began documenting what he saw, writing notes, recording times and dates, quietly collecting evidence. Not because he expected to expose the system, but because he needed to know that his own conscience wasn't lying to him. Then one day, an inmate begged him for help, not for release, not for favors, but for safety. In that moment, Nico realized he could no longer pretend. The system wasn't going to fix itself. Someone had to reveal the truth. He knew the risks. He knew the consequences. But he also knew he couldn't walk away from what he had witnessed. His decision would set off a chain reaction the country would never forget. In September 2012, it happened. Raw, unfiltered, undeniable footage from inside Gldani prison leaked to the public. Within hours, the recording spread across Georgia. Television networks interrupted their programming. Online platforms flooded with reactions. Families, activists, and political leaders all demanded answers. For the first time, the whispers about Gldani became visible. No more speculation. No more rumors. No more denying that the prison system had a crisis. Crowds gathered outside government buildings as public anger soared. The country, already in a tense political climate, now faced a storm that threatened to shake the foundations of its justice system. And at the center of it all was a single question: how long had this been happening? The government launched investigations. Officials resigned. International observers arrived. But for the people who lived inside Gldani, this wasn't just a political event. It was a moment of reckoning. Within days, international human rights organizations released statements. European watchdog groups demanded transparency. Even countries with their own troubled prison systems expressed shock at the revelations. Georgia had spent years trying to modernize its institutions and remove the remnants of Soviet-era practices. But Gldani exposed the truth. Change on paper doesn't always mean change in reality. News broadcasts showed images of protesters holding signs. Students marched through Tbilisi. Families who had loved ones inside the prison finally felt heard. The scandal was not just about corrections. It was about trust. Gldani had become the epicenter of a national crisis, and the world was watching. While the outside world erupted, life inside Gldani changed instantly. Inmates whispered about the footage. Some were relieved. Others were terrified of retaliation. The guards were tense. Supervisors held emergency meetings. Some staff members worried about becoming scapegoats. Others knew they might be investigated for their actions or their silence. Former inmates later described that time as the quiet storm. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone sensed that Gldani would never be the same. It's easy to talk about prisons as institutions, the walls, the rules, the officials. But at its core, any correctional system is made up of people. In Guldani, not every guard was cruel. Many were overwhelmed, undertrained, and afraid. One former officer described the job as standing in a room with pressure coming from every direction. You had inmates to control, supervisors to answer to, and colleagues who expected loyalty. Meanwhile, inmates battled isolation, fear, and uncertainty. The scandal forced people to see these individuals not as faceless parts of a system, but as humans, exhausted, conflicted, and deeply affected by the environment around them. In the months that followed, Georgia announced sweeping reforms. New leadership, new oversight, and higher standards for staff training. International observers acknowledged progress. But reform is never instantaneous. It's a slow process that requires time, commitment, and accountability. Gldani began walking that path, but its past remained a shadow that could not be erased. Years after his release, Levin, the young inmate who had tried to file a complaint, spoke publicly about his experience. He wasn't bitter or afraid. He simply wanted people to understand what the environment had done to him. He said Gldani taught him caution, patience, and the value of every small freedom, a sunrise, a quiet moment, a walk outside. But he also admitted that he still dreamed of the place. The noise of doors slamming shut, the hum of fluorescent lights, the echo of footsteps in empty hallways. Levin's story revealed a truth many former inmates share. Leaving prison doesn't mean the prison leaves you. Yet he had hope. He believed change was possible, and that the truth, no matter how painful, needed to be told. To truly understand the cracks in Gldani prison, we have to go back to an event rarely spoken about, a night remembered vividly by those who lived through it, the night of the silent riot. It didn't start with shouting or violence. It started with silence. One evening, long before the scandal broke, prisoners sensed something was wrong. The guards were on edge. Routine checks felt different. Doors opened and closed at strange times, and tense voices echoed through the halls. Whispers spread among inmates about a rumored transfer, a power struggle within the administration. No one knew the truth, but everyone felt the tension building. Then, the lights flickered. A normal power fluctuation, maybe, but this one lingered. A low hum cut through the hallways. Inmates stood still, pressing their ears against the cold metal of their cell doors. A former inmate described the feeling, saying it was like the whole building was holding its breath. And then, the shouting began. Not from the prisoners, but from deeper inside the block. It sounded like staff trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled. Orders were yelled. Footsteps thundered down the corridors. Keys rattled loudly, every sound bouncing off the concrete walls. Inside their cells, the men had no idea what was happening. Was it a fight? A transfer gone wrong? Had the tension finally snapped? All they could do was listen and wait. After what felt like hours, though it was probably no more than 30 minutes, the commotion died down. The lights stabilized. The doors stayed shut. The guards resumed their rounds, their movements stiff and calculated. The event was never officially explained. No record was ever released. But the story spread like wildfire through the inmate population, each version more unsettling than the last. They called it the silent riot. It wasn't a riot in the traditional sense. It was a moment when the system itself faltered, when fear and uncertainty rushed in to fill the void where control should have been. It became one of the many secrets buried deep within Guldani's walls, a chilling reminder that the stability inside was far more fragile than anyone on the outside could imagine. Every prison develops its own ecosystem, but Guldani's internal network, the unspoken channels of communication and influence, was something else entirely. Former prisoners described it as a layered structure. At the top were informal leaders who dictated the unwritten rules. Below them, mediators who settled disputes and handled negotiations. And at the bottom, the majority of inmates, just trying to survive without crossing the wrong person. But what made Guldani's network so unique was how it intertwined with the prison's official hierarchy. It wasn't just about corruption, it was about necessity. When the formal systems broke down, the inmates created their own order. Information traveled through vents, pipes, coded knocks on the walls, and folded scraps of paper passed from cell to cell during brief moments of movement. A single rumor could snake its way through the entire facility in just a few hours. A conflict could be resolved without a single guard ever knowing. A cry for help could travel from one block to another before breakfast. Some inmates used this network to stay safe. Others used it to build influence. But for most, it was purely a survival mechanism, a way to navigate an environment where the official channels felt completely unreliable. One former detainee explained that the network wasn't about power, it was about balance. Everyone was a part of it, whether they wanted to be or not. This underground system shaped every aspect of daily life inside Gldani. It determined who you could trust, who you shared information with, and who you stayed silent around. And ultimately, it decided which stories made it to the outside world. Many inmates believe that without this network, the prison would have collapsed under its own weight long before the scandal ever broke. Medical staff in prisons hold a unique position. They see everything, but they're expected to say very little. In Gldani, one of the most compelling accounts comes from a former prison nurse we'll call Mariam. She wasn't a political activist or a troublemaker. She just wanted to do her job, treat patients, follow procedures, and go home each day without incident. But Gldani didn't allow for neutrality. Mariam started noticing patterns. Inmates who would avoid medical checkups, even when they were clearly sick. Others who would approach her quietly, constantly looking over their shoulders before daring to speak. Men who seemed terrified during routine examinations, afraid to answer even the most basic questions. One evening, an inmate confided in her. He wasn't talking about mistreatment, but about fear. The fear of retaliation if he was seen as trouble. The fear of being labeled for simply asking for help. Mariam felt torn. She wanted to report her concerns, but she knew that speaking up could put the inmates, and herself, at serious risk. So, she chose a different path. She documented everything she saw, meticulously. She kept her medical logs perfectly accurate. She followed every protocol to the letter. She made sure every single file was complete. Years later, when the official investigations began, her records became crucial evidence, not of direct wrongdoing, but of inconsistencies. Missed appointments that were never rescheduled. Unexplained injuries noted in the margins. Sudden transfers of patients who had just requested follow-up care. Mariam's careful documentation helped investigators piece together the bigger picture inside Gldani. She didn't expose the system with a single explosive act like Nico the whistleblower, but she made sure the truth had a paper trail. Her story adds another critical layer to this narrative. In Gldani, even those who were trying to help were forced to operate under immense pressure. And then there was Nico, the whistleblower who risked everything. When the scandal finally broke, his identity became known. Some hailed him as a hero. Others accused him of betrayal. But to this day, his role in exposing the crisis remains one of the most consequential acts in the history of Georgia's correctional system. Nico didn't seek fame. He didn't join political movements or capitalize on his newfound notoriety. Instead, he stepped away from the system entirely, living his life quietly, almost anonymously. Friends say he lived with a mixture of relief and a constant, lingering fear. He worried about retaliation. He worried about how history would remember him. But he also carried the knowledge that his one decision had sparked a nationwide transformation. His story is a powerful reminder that sometimes it takes just one person, one moment of extraordinary courage, to force an entire system to confront its darkest flaws. After the videos went public, the Georgian government faced overwhelming pressure to act. Investigations swept through Gldani and other prisons across the country. Officials were questioned, and dozens of staff members were suspended or fired. For months, the entire prison system was put under a microscope. Former inmates were interviewed. Doctors were summoned to testify. Analysts pored over years of internal reports, while international organizations evaluated the reforms as they were being implemented. What emerged wasn't a single, isolated problem, but a deeply ingrained pattern. It was a system stretched thin by overcrowding, outdated practices, and a severe lack of transparency. A system where fear had become the default currency. A system where good people and bad people alike were shaped by the toxic environment around them. When the final reports were released, they didn't just expose the failures. They marked the beginning of a historic restructuring of Georgia's entire correction system. Gldani became the ultimate case study, a hard lesson learned through incredibly painful public exposure. Years after the reforms, journalists and human rights observers returned to Gldani to see the changes for themselves. This time, the prison looked different. Blocks had been renovated. Procedures were more transparent. New staff had been hired and trained under much stricter standards. Inmates reported better access to basic services, more structured routines, and more consistent oversight. One observer described the atmosphere as tense, but functional, a huge improvement from the chaos of the past. Still, challenges remained. Overcrowding continued to strain resources. Rehabilitation programs needed to be expanded. And the legacy of the past still haunted both the inmates and the officers who had lived through the scandal. But compared to the secrecy of earlier years, Gldani now operated with something it had always lacked: visibility. The world was watching. Reform teams monitored conditions. Advocacy groups kept lines of communication open with inmates. Families felt more confident that their loved ones finally had a voice. Gldani wasn't perfect, but it was no longer hidden. Years after the scandal, the people involved found themselves scattered across different paths. Some former inmates rebuilt their lives. Some officers resigned. Some continued working in the reform system, grateful for the changes. Nico, the whistleblower, lived quietly, but his impact remained undeniable. His actions reshaped the justice landscape of an entire nation. He became a symbol of the courage needed to confront powerful systems, even at great personal cost. Mariam, the nurse, continued her medical career. She rarely spoke about Gldani, but colleagues say she carried a sense of quiet resolve, a belief in documentation, in transparency, and in doing the right thing even when it feels dangerous. And Levin, the former inmate, spent years advocating for rehabilitation programs. He spoke about the emotional weight of incarceration, reminding people that prisons are not just structures, they're environments that shape human beings long after release. Their stories merged into one larger narrative. Gldani changed them, and in their own ways, they helped change Gldani. Gldani prison stands today as a symbol with two meanings. To some, it represents a painful past, a reminder of how vulnerable prison systems can become when transparency fades and accountability weakens. To others, it represents a turning point, proof that exposure, reform, and persistence can transform even the most troubled institutions. But to everyone watching this documentary, Gldani offers a deeper lesson. Prisons are reflections of society. How a country treats its incarcerated people reflects how it values justice, fairness, and humanity. And when a system fails, as Gldani once did, the consequences echo far beyond the prison walls. The story of Gldani is not just about Georgia. It's about every nation struggling to balance punishment with rehabilitation, order with compassion, security with dignity. And it's a reminder that even in the darkest corners of a system, truth, once revealed, has the power to reshape everything. What you've just witnessed is a world most people will never see, a world where survival isn't guaranteed, and where every choice comes with a cost. In prisons built on fear, loyalty is the only currency, and betrayal is the only crime that never gets forgiven. But remember this: prison isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. Some break, some rise, and some become legends in the shadows. If this journey shook you, if it opened your eyes to a reality buried behind concrete and steel, then don't stop here. Like the video, share it, and subscribe, because the stories only get darker from here. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Stay alert.